What if I told you that everything you've ever done to be liked, accepted, or approved of has been slowly killing the person you were meant to become? What if the very foundation of your social existence, the desperate need for others to validate your worth, is the invisible prison that keeps you from discovering your authentic self? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the depths of the human psyche, understood something profound about human nature that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. He discovered that when we live for others' approval, we don't just lose ourselves, we create what he called a false persona, a mask so convincing that even we forget who lies beneath it. But here's what Jung knew that will change everything. The moment you stop living for others' approval, something extraordinary happens. Your true self, the one that's been waiting patiently in the shadows of your unconscious, finally has permission to emerge. And when it does, the transformation is nothing short of miraculous. Today, I'm going to share with you the 7 profound changes that occur when you finally break free from the approval addiction that has been silently orchestrating your life. These aren't just psychological theories. They're the very mechanisms through which your soul reclaims its sovereignty. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not only why you've been living for others' approval, but how to step into the authentic power that has been your birthright all along. The first transformation happens in the realm of what Jung called projection. For years, maybe decades, you've been unconsciously projecting your own rejected qualities onto others, seeking their approval to feel whole. But when you stop this exhausting dance, something remarkable occurs. You begin to withdraw these projections and reclaim the disowned parts of yourself. Imagine Sarah, a talented artist who spent 30 years painting what she thought would sell, what critics would praise, what her family would find acceptable. Every brushstroke was calculated for approval. But Sarah didn't realize she was projecting her own creative authenticity onto external validators, believing that only their recognition could make her art, and by extension herself, valuable. The day Sarah decided to paint from her soul rather than for applause, she experienced what Jung called the return of the projection. Suddenly, the creativity she had given away to others' opinions flooded back into her consciousness. She wasn't just painting, she was retrieving fragments of her authentic self that had been scattered across the opinions of others. This is the psychological alchemy that occurs when you stop seeking approval. You stop giving your power away through projection. Jung understood that we often seek approval from others precisely because we've rejected those qualities in ourselves. The perfectionist seeks approval from other perfectionists because they can't accept their own standards. The rebel seeks validation from other rebels because they can't own their own defiance. When you cease this projection, you begin what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who others want you to be. Your energy, previously scattered across 1,000 different approval-seeking behaviors, consolidates into a powerful force of authentic self-expression. The second transformation touches the very core of your shadow, those aspects of yourself that you've hidden away because they weren't socially acceptable. When you live for approval, your shadow grows larger and more powerful, fed by every authentic impulse you suppress to maintain your likable image. Consider Marcus, a man who spent his career being the nice guy at work, never speaking up, never disagreeing, always accommodating. His shadow contained all his authentic opinions, his righteous anger, his desire to lead. But these qualities threatened his image as someone everyone could like, so he pushed them deeper into his unconscious. Jung warned that what we resist persists, and Marcus's suppressed authenticity began manifesting in unexpected ways: passive aggression, chronic dissatisfaction, and a creeping sense that his life belonged to someone else. His shadow was trying to speak, but he kept silencing it with another smile, another yes when he meant no. The moment Marcus stopped prioritizing others' approval, his shadow began to integrate. This wasn't a violent explosion of suppressed rage. It was a gradual, conscious reclaiming of his full humanity. He discovered that his opinions weren't dangerous. They were essential. His anger wasn't destructive, it was protective. His desire to lead wasn't selfish, it was service. This shadow integration is perhaps the most profound gift of abandoning approval-seeking. Jung taught that we cannot become whole by remaining partial, and approval addiction keeps us perpetually partial, showing only the acceptable parts while hiding the rest. When you stop performing for approval, you give your shadow permission to emerge not as an enemy, but as an ally carrying the very qualities you need to become authentic. The consequence is extraordinary. You become comfortable with the fullness of your humanity. You no longer split yourself into good parts that others can approve of and bad parts that must be hidden. You begin to understand that your complexity isn't a flaw to be managed. It's the very source of your depth and authenticity. The third transformation occurs in the realm of what Jung called the anima and animus, the feminine and masculine energies within every person, regardless of gender. When we live for approval, we often suppress one of these energies because it doesn't fit the socially acceptable version of who we should be. Take Jennifer, a successful executive who learned early that displaying emotional intelligence and intuitive decision-making, qualities associated with the feminine, would undermine her authority in a male-dominated field. She suppressed her anima, becoming overly rational, competitive, and disconnected from her deeper wisdom. Every decision was calculated for how it would be perceived, not for what felt authentic. Or consider David, a sensitive man who learned that expressing vulnerability and nurturing qualities would threaten his masculine image. He suppressed his anima so completely that he became rigid, emotionally unavailable, and perpetually exhausted from maintaining a facade of invulnerability. When you stop living for approval, you give both energies permission to express themselves naturally. Jennifer began trusting her intuition alongside her analytical skills, discovering that her authentic leadership style was far more powerful than her performative one. David allowed his sensitivity to emerge, finding that his capacity for emotional depth made him more attractive, not less. Jung understood that psychological wholeness requires the integration of both masculine and feminine energies within the individual. When we seek approval, we often sacrifice one energy for the other, believing we must fit into prescribed gender roles to be accepted. But when we abandon this performance, we access the full spectrum of our psychological resources. The result is a kind of inner marriage, what Jung called the conjunctio, where your masculine and feminine energies support rather than compete with each other. You become complete within yourself, no longer seeking external relationships to provide what you've denied in your own nature. This is perhaps why people who stop seeking approval often find that their relationships dramatically improve. They're no longer approaching others from a place of deficit, seeking someone to complete them. Instead, they offer their wholeness, attracting connections based on authentic compatibility rather than unconscious need. The fourth transformation happens in your relationship with what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness that represents your highest potential. When you live for approval, you're essentially worshipping false gods. Other people's opinions become the ultimate authority on your worth, drowning out the quiet voice of your authentic self. Think of it this way: every time you modify your behavior to gain approval, you're sending a message to your unconscious that your authentic impulses aren't trustworthy. You're teaching yourself that your inner wisdom is less valuable than external validation. Over time, this creates what Jung might have called a disconnection from the self. You lose touch with your own inner guidance system. But when you stop seeking approval, something sacred occurs. You begin to hear the voice of your authentic self again. This isn't the ego's voice, with its constant need for validation and comparison. This is the deeper voice that knows your true path, your real values, your authentic contribution to the world. Maria experienced this profound shift when she left her prestigious law career, a path chosen entirely for family approval, to become a therapist. The decision made no sense to her rational mind or her family's expectations, but it felt aligned with something deeper. Jung would say she was finally listening to herself rather than her personas. This reconnection with the self is transformative because it provides an internal compass that never lies. When you're aligned with your authentic self, decisions become clearer, not because they're easier, but because they're aligned with your deepest truth. You stop second-guessing yourself constantly because you're finally in relationship with the part of you that actually knows who you are. The psychological consequence is profound. You develop what Jung called individuation, the ongoing process of becoming more fully yourself. You stop trying to be perfect or universally liked and start trying to be authentic and aligned. The relief of this shift is extraordinary, like finally being able to breathe after holding your breath for years. Before we continue with the remaining transformations, I want to pause and acknowledge something important. If you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, if you're beginning to see how approval seeking has shaped your life, you're not alone. This recognition itself is the beginning of your liberation. The fifth transformation involves what Jung understood about the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns that influence all of humanity. When you live for approval, you're not just responding to individual people. You're responding to collective patterns, archetypal expectations of how you should be. Consider the archetype of the good girl or the nice guy, collective patterns that many people unconsciously embody to gain approval. These aren't individual creations. They're archetypal roles that promise acceptance in exchange for authenticity. When you inhabit these roles, you're not just seeking approval from specific people. You're seeking approval from the collective, from society itself. But here's what Jung discovered. When you stop conforming to these collective patterns, you begin to individuate not just personally, but collectively. You become what he called a differentiated individual, someone who can contribute something unique to the collective rather than simply reflecting it back. Take the example of Rosa Parks, who violated the collective pattern of compliance expected from African American women in 1955. Her refusal to give up her bus seat wasn't just a personal act of authenticity. It was a moment when individual authenticity challenged collective patterns, ultimately transforming society itself. When you stop living for approval, you often find yourself naturally challenging collective patterns that no longer serve. This isn't rebellion for its own sake. It's the natural result of authentic living. You begin to see how many social norms are simply collective approval, seeking mechanisms, and you start choosing conscious participation over unconscious compliance. The psychological shift here is profound. You move from being a passive recipient of collective patterns to becoming a conscious contributor to collective evolution. Jung believed that individual authenticity was essential for collective health, that societies need individuals who can think and feel authentically to avoid stagnation. This transformation often manifests as a natural inclination toward leadership, not the kind of leadership that seeks power or approval, but the kind that emerges from authentic self-expression. People who have stopped living for approval often become natural catalysts for change, because they're no longer invested in maintaining the status quo for the sake of acceptance. The sixth transformation touches the deepest level of Jung's understanding, the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. When you live for approval, you're essentially allowing your unconscious to be programmed by external forces. Every approval you seek and receive reinforces unconscious patterns about what makes you valuable. Over time, this creates what Jung might have called possession by external complexes. Your unconscious becomes so identified with gaining approval that it automatically generates thoughts, feelings, and behaviors designed to maintain your likable image, even when this conflicts with your authentic nature. But when you stop seeking approval, you begin what Jung called making the unconscious conscious. You start to see these automatic patterns for what they are, learned responses that once served a purpose but now limit your authentic expression. This is often accompanied by what Jung called active imagination, a natural increase in your ability to access deeper layers of your psyche through dreams, creative expression, and intuitive insights. When you're not constantly focused on managing your image, your psychic energy becomes available for deeper exploration. The practical result is an increased capacity for what Jung called psychological sophistication, the ability to observe your own psychological processes with clarity and compassion. You begin to notice when you're slipping into approval-seeking patterns, and you develop the capacity to choose differently. This consciousness transformation is perhaps the most sustainable aspect of breaking free from approval addiction. Once you've seen these patterns clearly, it becomes much harder to unconsciously fall back into them. You develop what might be called approval immunity, not because you don't care what others think, but because you're conscious of when and why their opinions matter. Now we come to the seventh and most profound transformation, what Jung would have recognized as the emergence of your authentic authority. When you stop living for others' approval, you must inevitably develop your own internal system of values, your own way of determining what matters. This isn't the authority of dominance or control. It's what Jung might have called psychological sovereignty. You become the ultimate authority on your own experience, your own truth, your own path. This doesn't mean you become isolated or indifferent to others. It means you relate to others from a place of choice rather than need. Think of this like becoming the king or queen of your own psychological kingdom. For years, you've been letting external forces rule your inner world, making decisions based on what would gain approval rather than what felt authentic. But when you reclaim this authority, you begin making decisions from your center rather than your periphery. This transformation often manifests as what others perceive as increased confidence, but it's actually something deeper. It's the natural presence that emerges when someone is no longer at war with themselves. People who have stopped seeking approval often report that others seem more drawn to them, more trusting of their judgment, more willing to follow their lead. Jung would have understood this as the natural magnetism of authenticity. When you're no longer performing for approval, you're no longer emanating the subtle desperation that approval-seeking creates. Instead, you emanate what might be called authentic presence, the unmistakable energy of someone who knows who they are. The psychological consequence of this transformation is profound. You become capable of genuine intimacy for the first time. When you're not constantly managing your image, you can actually be present with others. When you're not seeking their approval, you can actually see them clearly. When you're not performing, you can actually connect. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this seventh transformation is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism through which opposing forces within the psyche unite to create something greater than either could achieve alone. When you stop seeking approval, you often find that you can hold paradoxes that once seemed impossible. You become simultaneously confident and humble, strong and vulnerable, independent and connected. These aren't contradictions to be resolved, they're polarities to be integrated. And this integration is what Jung saw as the ultimate goal of psychological development. Not the elimination of tension, but the conscious holding of creative tension. As we reach the culmination of this journey, I want to share with you the most profound truth that Jung discovered about what happens when you stop living for others' approval. you don't become selfish. You become selfless in the truest sense. This might seem paradoxical, but Jung understood that true selflessness requires a strong sense of self. When you're constantly seeking approval, you're actually trapped in a subtle form of self-obsession. You're constantly worried about how you're being perceived, constantly adjusting your behavior based on others' reactions. But when you stop seeking approval, you become free to actually serve others authentically. You can offer your genuine gifts rather than performing what you think others want to see. You can speak your truth rather than telling people what they want to hear. You can love from abundance rather than need. This is what Jung might have called authentic service, the natural impulse to contribute that emerges when you're no longer consumed with managing your image. People who have stopped seeking approval often find themselves naturally drawn to work that serves something larger than themselves because they're no longer trapped in the endless cycle of self-validation. The final psychological transformation is perhaps the most beautiful. You begin to understand that your authentic self is not a static thing to be discovered, but a dynamic process to be lived. Jung called this process individuation, and he saw it as the primary task of human life, not to become someone else's version of perfect, but to become ever more fully yourself. This means that stopping the search for approval isn't a destination. It's the beginning of a lifelong journey of authentic self-expression. Every day becomes an opportunity to choose authenticity over approval, truth over performance, depth over surface. And here's the profound paradox that Jung would have appreciated. When you stop seeking approval, you often receive more genuine appreciation than you ever did when you were trying to earn it. But by then, you no longer need it in the same way. It becomes a gift rather than a necessity, a reflection rather than a requirement. As we come to the end of this exploration, I invite you to consider your own relationship with approval. Where in your life are you still performing rather than being? Where are you still seeking external validation for truths that can only be confirmed from within? Jung believed that the individuation process, the journey toward authentic selfhood, was not just a personal endeavor, but a gift to the collective. When you become more fully yourself, you don't just transform your own life. You give others permission to do the same. The ripple effects of your authenticity extend far beyond what you can see. Every time you choose truth over approval, you're contributing to a more authentic world. Every time you express your genuine self rather than your performed self, you're helping to heal the collective wound of approval addiction. So I leave you with this question, one that Jung might have asked. What would you do? How would you be? What would you create if you knew that your worth was never in question? The answer to that question is not just the key to your individual liberation, it's your unique contribution to the healing of our world. Your authentic self isn't waiting for permission to emerge. It's waiting for you to stop seeking approval long enough to hear its voice. And when you do, the transformation that follows isn't just personal, it's evolutionary. The journey from approval-seeking to authentic being is perhaps the most courageous path a human can take. It requires you to disappoint some people, to stand alone sometimes, to trust your inner knowing, even when the outer world questions it. But Jung understood something profound about this courage. It's not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger than fear, the irrepressible call of your authentic self, demanding to be lived. That call is your birthright. That authenticity is your gift to the world. And the moment you stop living for others' approval is the moment you begin living for the truth that can only be spoken through your unique existence. The transformation has already begun. You need only choose to continue.